Hey, anybody ever told you you look like Jay Leno?
Hey, Mr. President, how are you, sir?
You'd think being a former US president guarantees a life of luxury. But what if I told you that some past US presidents didn't retire to golden estates, but to humble homes and modest lifestyles? What drove these leaders to live like they were poor? From financial struggles to personal choices, their stories are truly captivating. So, buckle up as we unveil former US presidents that live like they are poor. Number 12. Harry S. Truman. Imagine being the leader of the free world, holding the highest office in the land, only to return to a life so humble it almost seemed like poverty. As the 33rd President of the United States, he ascended to the office unexpectedly after Franklin D. Roosevelt's sudden death in 1945. He was thrust into the nation's highest office during one of the most pivotal moments in history. World War II was nearing its end, and the Cold War was taking shape. Truman's presidency saw the use of atomic bombs in Japan, the establishment of the United Nations, and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. Despite leading the country through momentous events, Truman remained remarkably down-to-earth during his time in office. Truman was known for his humble lifestyle, preferring modest clothes and home-cooked meals over the lavish extras of the presidency. He and his wife Bess would return to their simple Missouri home during breaks from the White House, showing little interest in the luxury made available to him. Truman once famously stated, "The buck stops here," emphasizing his commitment to accountability and personal responsibility, a principle that also shaped his life after the presidency. After leaving office in 1953, Truman returned to his hometown of Independence, Missouri. Unlike many modern presidents who capitalize on their post-presidential status through lucrative book deals and speaking engagements, Truman refused to monetize his position for personal gain. He declined offers for commercial endorsements, claiming that doing so would demean the dignity of the presidency. He turned down multiple offers for consulting fees and board memberships, believing that his service to the country had been payment enough. Truman's financial situation was dire after leaving office. The former president had no pension to rely on at the time. Presidential pensions were established later in 1958 due to his situation. His only income came from his military pension as a retired officer, which was a meager $112.56 per month. Truman and his wife Bess famously took a road trip across the country in 1953. Without Secret Service protection or any grand entourage, they packed their Chrysler New Yorker and set off to explore the U.S. like ordinary citizens. The trip, during which they stayed at modest motels and ate at local diners, reflected Truman's rejection of any special privileges, despite having been the most powerful man in the world just months earlier. This humble lifestyle continued throughout Truman's retirement, and his modest home in Independence became a national landmark. Truman lived without luxuries, answering his own phone, and even personally responding to fan mail. When asked about his simple lifestyle, he often joked that all he needed were three things: an old car, a good suit, and a clear conscience. Number 11. James Monroe. While Truman lived a life that often mirrored that of an ordinary citizen after his presidency, another former leader, James Monroe, also faced an unexpected reality after leaving office. The fifth President of the United States is often remembered for his role in shaping the nation during a period of expansion and transition. But there's more to his story than just the famous Monroe Doctrine and his diplomatic successes. Behind the scenes, Monroe faced financial struggles and lived a simple life that influenced both his presidency and later years. Monroe's time as president was characterized by a simple lifestyle that stood in sharp contrast to the growing wealth in parts of America. His home, Highland Plantation in Virginia, was more about duty than luxury. Unlike today's lavish presidential residences, Highland was a modest house where Monroe lived with basic furnishings. He was careful with his spending, avoiding unnecessary expenses and focusing on essentials instead. This simplicity wasn't just a personal choice for Monroe. It was also necessary due to limited income sources compared to modern standards. With little room for financial mistakes, he demonstrated prudence, a quality admired by many who see presidents from humble beginnings as examples of resilience and frugality. Monroe was driven by values deeply rooted in Republican virtue and public service. He believed in serving citizens with integrity and transparency, often prioritizing national interest over personal gain. He would frequently walk instead of using government-provided transportation to save taxpayer money. His commitment to service extended beyond his presidential duties. A notable example is when he personally financed parts of the nation's defense during the War of 1812. In the early days of America, living simply wasn't always a choice, but often a necessity for many people. Society valued self-reliance and modesty, an environment where Monroe's life naturally fit in. Though he was a leader, he wasn't exempt from financial problems that affected ordinary citizens. Monroe's post-presidency years show this clearly. Deeply in debt after leaving office, even keeping up with his plantation became an uphill battle. He turned to Congress for help, a difficult task as getting approval proved challenging amidst political complexities. After Elizabeth Monroe's passing, James found himself living with his daughter due to financial constraints preventing him from owning a home. Number 10. Jimmy Carter. Monroe wasn't the only president to face hardships in retirement. Another former leader who redefined modest living in his post-presidential years was Jimmy Carter. While many expect ex-presidents to bask in luxury, Carter's life after the White House took an unexpected turn that continues to surprise people to this day. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, is often celebrated for his steadfast commitment to human rights and energy conservation during his tenure. However, despite the noble ideals he championed, his presidency concluded with less than favorable approval ratings. Yet it's his post-presidential life that has truly captured the admiration of many. Living modestly in Plains, Georgia, Carter's lifestyle contrasts with the luxury typically associated with former heads of state. In the quaint town of Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter chose to reside in a home valued far below the extravagant mansions occupied by many ex-presidents. This humble abode speaks volumes about Carter's values and priorities. Instead of basking in luxury, he immersed himself in community life, where neighbors are friends and simplicity is treasured. Post-presidency, Carter dedicated himself to humanitarian endeavors, most notably through Habitat for Humanity. Even into his 90s, he demonstrated relentless dedication by physically participating in building homes for those in need. Despite having served as president, Carter's lifestyle choices are refreshingly real. For instance, rather than opting for private jets or first-class flights, he often flies commercial, a choice that surprises and delights fellow passengers who recognize him on board. Shopping at stores like Dollar General further exemplifies his down-to-earth nature. These small yet significant habits paint a picture of a leader who practices what he preaches. One memorable instance occurred when Carter was seen leaving a flight carrying his own luggage, an image resonating with authenticity and approachability rarely associated with figures of such stature. Another tale recounts how he continues to teach Sunday school at his local church, sharing wisdom not from a pedestal, but amidst peers. Number 9. Rutherford B. Hayes. Carter's humble post-presidential life of service wasn't a solitary occurrence in American history. Long before him, there was another president whose post-White House years were equally remarkable for their simplicity and dedication to the public good, Rutherford B. Hayes. He is one of the most interesting figures in American presidential history. As the 19th President of the United States, he came to power after one of the most disputed elections, which eventually brought an end to Reconstruction in the South. His time in office was marked by efforts to heal a nation still dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War, although these efforts often caused controversy and division. Despite the challenges during his presidency, Hayes stayed committed to his principles and kept his campaign promise. He served only one term and didn't run for re-election. This choice, driven by principle rather than political ambition, set him apart from many other presidents of his time. It also paved the way for a post-presidential life focused on simplicity and service, in contrast to the turbulent years he spent leading the country. After leaving office, Hayes moved back to Fremont, Ohio. There, he embraced a quiet life away from the public eye. In this peaceful environment, Hayes found a new purpose and dedicated much of his time to two key areas. Hayes strongly supported educational initiatives because he believed education was crucial for reducing economic inequality, a belief that guided him throughout his life. He also worked tirelessly to improve conditions within prisons and pushed for reforms that would give inmates a chance at rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Despite having opportunities that could have made him wealthy after his presidency, Hayes remained focused on public service instead. When comparing net worth among U.S. presidents, Hayes stands out as an example of someone who lived like those less fortunate, truly embodying what it means to live simply while striving for greater societal good. Number 8. Ulysses S. Grant. While Hayes chose a life of quiet simplicity after his presidency, another American leader would face a far more turbulent post-White House existence. Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States, is often remembered for his military genius that helped the Union secure victory during the Civil War. As president from 1869 to 1877, his leadership was marked by efforts to stabilize post-war America and enforce civil rights. However, beneath the surface of his political career lay a saga of personal and financial struggles that paints him as a former U.S. president who lived like he was poor. After leaving the White House, Grant's life took a dramatic turn. Despite the prestige of his presidency, he found himself caught in financial troubles. His problems started when he was cheated by a business partner, Ferdinand Ward. Known as the young Napoleon of Wall Street, Ward set up a Ponzi scheme through their firm, Grant and Ward, which eventually collapsed in 1884. This disaster wiped out Grant's savings and left him nearly broke. The timing couldn't have been worse. Shortly after this financial catastrophe, Grant was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. With bleak prospects for recovery or financial security, he turned to writing as a last resort to provide for his family. In his final years, Grant showed incredible strength. He began writing his memoirs, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Despite being in terrible pain from his illness, he worked hard and finished them just days before he died in 1885. The memoirs were published after his death and became an instant success, bringing significant financial relief to his family. Grant's financial troubles highlighted how former presidents weren't supported well at that time. The Former Presidents Act, which today ensures a pension for past presidents, wasn't established until 1958, long after Grant's lifetime. Before resorting to writing, Grant tried various business ventures in hopes of securing financial stability. He made investments in real estate that didn't yield expected returns. Also, multiple partnerships were pursued, but often failed due to a lack of foresight or trustworthiness among associates. His most infamous venture with Ferdinand Ward ended disastrously due to Ward's fraudulent activities. Number 7. Calvin Coolidge. When you think of the Roaring Twenties, luxury and exuberance often come to mind. Enter Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, who, believe it or not, took a distinctly different path. After Warren G. Harding's sudden death, Coolidge became president. He was known for being modest and simple. Coolidge's lifestyle was all about keeping things simple during a time when everyone else seemed to be living extravagantly. People didn't just talk about him being thrifty, he had specific habits that he followed religiously. Instead of fancy state dinners, he preferred homemade meals. And instead of buying new clothes, he would patch up his old ones. These daily choices showed his belief that having less can sometimes be more. Even while residing in the White House, Coolidge maintained a personal ledger, meticulously tracking every expense down to the last cent. He famously avoided using government cars unless absolutely necessary, preferring instead to walk or take public transportation. These practices weren't just for show, they were deeply embedded in his philosophy toward governance and life itself. Known affectionately as Silent Cal, Coolidge was characterized by his quiet demeanor and conservative fiscal policies. His hands-off approach wasn't just political talk, it reflected his broader views on accumulating wealth versus serving the public. In speeches and writings that have survived through history, Coolidge consistently matched values that championed public service over personal gain. "Wealth comes from industry and thrift," he once remarked, encapsulating his belief that prosperity should not lead to profligacy, but instead be an opportunity for prudent stewardship. His post-presidency years reflected this same character, living quietly without fanfare or flashy displays of wealth. His choices reflected his belief that true wealth lies in service and simplicity, establishing him as a former president who embraced a lifestyle reminiscent of those less fortunate. Number 6. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, a name that brings to mind diplomacy, scholarly pursuits, and an unwavering commitment to public service. As the son of John Adams, one might assume a life filled with prestige and abundance. However, his story is one of modest living and steadfast principles that speak volumes about the financial struggles of former presidents. Before becoming president, John Quincy Adams held many important positions. He was a skilled diplomat who worked in various roles across Europe. His contributions were crucial in shaping foreign policy, earning him a reputation as a brilliant statesman. However, when it came to his presidency, from 1825 to 1829, things took an unexpected turn. Despite his diplomatic brilliance, his presidency faced political opposition and lackluster success. After leaving the White House, Adams showed that true service knows no limits. Instead of retiring into luxury, he made an incredible decision to return to Congress. Here he found his calling once again, this time as a vocal opponent of slavery. His role in Congress was deeply impactful. He became known as Old Man Eloquent, passionately advocating for abolition and fighting against the gag rule that prohibited discussions on slavery. Adams's post-presidential years were characterized by simplicity rather than extravagance. Unlike many who might enjoy luxury after holding the nation's highest office, Adams chose a life grounded in modesty. He did not accumulate wealth through public office. Instead, he focused on intellectual pursuits and civic duties. His lifestyle choices reflected his values: simplicity over luxury and substance over style. Number 5. Andrew Johnson. While John Quincy Adams led a simple life after his presidency, some might think that stepping down from the nation's highest office would bring an end to public struggles. But not for Andrew Johnson. His post-presidential years would show that sometimes the battle to survive in this world goes beyond the political arena, into something much more personal and financially uncertain. Often considered one of the poorest individuals to have ever held office, Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, moved from a humble beginning to the corridors of power. Born in a log cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina, in 1808, Johnson's early life was marked by financial struggle and personal adversity. Orphaned at a young age, he never had the privilege of formal education, a fact that did not deter him, but rather fueled his determination to succeed. Johnson's rise from poverty to the presidency is a story of relentless ambition and hard work. As a young apprentice tailor, he taught himself to read and write, developing a passion for debate and public speaking. His early political career began when he was elected as an alderman in Greenville, Tennessee. Through mere tenacity and an uncanny ability to connect with the common man, he climbed the political ladder, eventually serving as governor and U.S. Senator. Johnson's ascent to the presidency came under somber circumstances. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln thrust him into the role unexpectedly. This transition was not smooth as it occurred during one of America's most stormy periods, Reconstruction after the Civil War. The economic challenges Johnson faced throughout his life significantly influenced his political decisions. Having experienced poverty firsthand, Johnson was deeply sympathetic to the plight of poor white Southerners during Reconstruction. His lenient policies towards the former Confederate states reflected his belief in rapid reintegration without heavy penalties, a stance that made him unpopular with radical Republicans in Congress. This leniency was perceived as undermining efforts to secure rights for newly freed slaves and led to significant discord between Johnson and Congress. His vetoes on civil rights legislation were overridden repeatedly, showcasing how his economic background clashed with prevailing political ideologies of the time. Andrew Johnson's presidency became synonymous with conflict and controversy. His opposition to congressional Reconstruction policies reached its peak when he became the first president in U.S. history to be impeached by the House of Representatives. The charge? Violating the Tenure of Office Act by attempting to remove Edwin M. Stanton, a staunch radical Republican, from his position as Secretary of War. Johnson narrowly avoided removal from office by just one vote in the Senate trial, proof of how divisive his leadership had become. Despite these challenges, his personal life remained real. He continued living modestly even while occupying such a high office. After leaving office, Andrew Johnson returned to Tennessee where he resumed his political career, serving briefly again as a U.S. Senator before his death. He maintained a simple lifestyle characterized by modesty and frugality until his passing in 1875. Number 4. Thomas Jefferson. While Andrew Johnson lived a simple life by choice, here is the story of another president who succumbed to poverty. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, is widely regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers. Known for drafting the Declaration of Independence and orchestrating the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson's contributions to the early development of the country were immense. However, his personal finances were a different story. As president, Jefferson led a comfortable life, with the Monticello estate showcasing his wealthy plantation-owning status. While in office, he managed both his personal affairs and the nation's, though cracks in his financial foundation were already showing. Once out of office in 1801, Jefferson's financial troubles began to unravel more publicly. His massive estate, Monticello, had already been bleeding money due to Jefferson's expensive lifestyle, poor financial decisions, and the economic downturn following the War of 1812. By the time he retired, he was carrying significant debts due to his lavish expenditures on books, wine, furniture, and the construction of Monticello itself. Despite having inherited a substantial fortune and owning expansive lands and slaves, Jefferson was, by the end of his life, over $100,000 in debt, which was a huge sum for the time. The cause of Jefferson's financial downfall wasn't just his personal expenses, but also his willingness to take on family debts, including those of his father-in-law and daughter. The agricultural industry was declining, and his estate struggled to produce enough income to keep him afloat. To try and salvage his finances, Jefferson even petitioned the Virginia General Assembly to allow him to hold a lottery in 1826 to sell off much of his property in Monticello, but this measure failed to meet his needs. Jefferson's declining financial situation led him to sell one of his most prized possessions, his extensive personal library. He sold the collection, consisting of around 6,500 volumes, to the U.S. government to help establish the Library of Congress. It was an emotional loss for Jefferson, but one of necessity. In his final years, Jefferson struggled immensely to maintain his dignity as his financial situation worsened. Despite his struggles, he continued to host guests at Monticello, often relying on borrowed funds to do so, showcasing a tragic determination to maintain the appearance of prosperity. Thomas Jefferson passed away on July 4, 1826, leaving behind a monumental legacy, but also a considerable amount of debt. His estate was eventually sold to cover the financial obligations he left behind. Number 3. James Garfield. James Abram Garfield's journey from humble beginnings to the presidency is a model American tale of ambition and resilience. Born in a log cabin in Ohio, Garfield embodied the classic rags to riches story long before it became a popular trope. His early life was marked by poverty, as his father passed away when he was just 2 years old, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings on her own. Despite these circumstances, Garfield was propelled by an insatiable thirst for knowledge and self-improvement. At a young age, Garfield worked various odd jobs to support his education, including being a carpenter and even steering canal boats. His determination eventually led him to Williams College in Massachusetts, where he graduated with honors. This academic success catapulted him into a career as an educator and later into politics. Garfield's presidency was tragically brief, but not without significance. Elected as the 20th President of the United States in 1880, his time in office was abruptly cut short by an assassin's bullet just 4 months into his term. The sense of urgency surrounding his assassination is tangible. It was a blow not only to his family, but also to the nation that had pinned its hopes on his leadership. The post-assassination period was fraught with uncertainty. For 80 excruciating days, Garfield battled for survival while the country watched anxiously. Eventually succumbing to his wounds, Garfield left his family facing considerable financial strain. Despite holding the highest office in the land, Garfield's untimely death plunged his family into financial distress. Unlike today's standards, there was no substantial pension or financial safety net for former presidents' families at that time. His widow, Lucretia Garfield, faced immediate economic challenges upon losing her husband, what might seem unthinkable today, given the stature of their position. The community rallied around them. Public donations helped alleviate some pressures, but could not fully compensate for the absence of steady income. Garfield's limited presidential salary, while respectable, was insufficient to secure long-term financial stability for his family without extensive personal savings or investments. Number 2. Herbert Hoover. A name that often brings to mind images of economic despair and long lines at soup kitchens in America's cities. But before the Great Depression overshadowed his presidency, Hoover was a giant in the business world. Born in a small Iowa village, Hoover worked his way up to become a respected mining engineer and self-made millionaire. His skills took him all over the world, from the tough terrains of Australia to the busy mines of China. This world-traveling businessman was praised for his efficiency and problem-solving skills. However, despite his professional successes, he also faced criticism. Some people saw him as distant and inflexible, qualities that would later come to light during his political career. When Hoover became president in 1929, he had high hopes for America's prosperity. But destiny had other plans. Just months into his term, the stock market crashed dramatically, leading to the Great Depression. Suddenly, Hoover's initial efforts at economic recovery were overshadowed by a wave of unemployment and poverty. Although he introduced measures like public works projects and encouraged voluntary cooperation to stabilize the economy, these attempts were mostly seen as too little, too late. Public opinion turned cold as Hoovervilles, makeshift towns named mockingly after him, sprang up across the country. Leaving office with a reputation damaged by economic turmoil, one might think that Hoover would retreat into luxury to heal his wounds. Yet surprisingly, this former president chose a path marked by simplicity and service, rather than extravagance or self-indulgence. After his presidency ended in 1933, he redirected his energy toward humanitarian efforts, proof of his resilience and dedication to public service. Despite being a successful businessman before coming into power, Hoover lived modestly after leaving office. He avoided extravagant living in favor of a life dedicated to helping others rebuild theirs, amid widespread hardship. He became actively involved in relief efforts during World War II and played a key role in organizing food aid for war-torn Europe. Number 1. Martin Van Buren. Imagine taking charge of a ship just as a storm begins to brew. This was exactly the situation Martin Van Buren found himself in when he became president in 1837. As the 8th president of the United States, Van Buren's time in office was plagued by the Panic of 1837, an economic crisis that swept across the nation like a tidal wave, leaving financial ruin in its wake. Van Buren's administration struggled with widespread bank failures and unemployment. While his policies aimed at economic recovery, they often met with limited success. His presidency is often overshadowed by this financial turmoil. After leaving office, one might expect a former president to enjoy a life of comfort and stability. However, Van Buren's reality was quite different. The economic depression that defined his presidency followed him into his post-presidential years like an unwelcome shadow. Despite having held the highest office in the land, Van Buren was never what one might call wealthy. While he did own a large estate called Lindenwold in Kinderhook, New York, this was no sign of wealth, but rather a reflection of his modest lifestyle choices. Poor investments further worsened his financial troubles, forcing him to live simply on his estate. He worked on his land and focused on enjoying life's simple pleasures. Away from the political spotlight, he found comfort in writing and participating in local community affairs. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.